Welcome to Backyard Cigars. So glad that you could join me once again. Today we're going to pay homage to one of the greatest cigar smokers of all time, and that is George Burns. My Little Lady. That's what George Burns called his favorite cigar. The El Producto Queens was sold in clear glass tubos and was once a highly regarded smoke. Today we're going to look into the past of George Burns' Little Lady, and we're going to take a closer look and discover its glory. Join me.
You by the Consolidated Cigar Corporation, makers of El Producto, the cigar of natural mildness.
Here's George Burns for El Producto Cigars.
You know, these new dances are terrific. You can smoke a cigar and dance at the same time.
Gosh, Mr. Burns, you're good. You're spoiling me.
Well, I used to dance a little in Vaudeville.
Vaudeville? Where's that?
Just this side of Altoona. I'll tell you where I'm spoiled. That's my cigar. El Producto. Once you try an El Producto, you won't settle for anything less. That's because they're mild. Naturally mild. Spoil yourself a little. Walk down to your dealers and ask them for George's cigar. El Producto.
For natural mildness in a tip cigar, try El Producto's Elegant Diamond Tip. 2 for 25 cents. For a new high in natural mildness, try El Producto's Tall, Stylish Alta. Buy 5 in the handy folder pack.
Trees, flowers, I let Mother Nature handle those details. But cigar tobacco is mine. I'm Father Nature, and I love a quality cigar like El Producto. See that wrapper? My great tobacco, shade grown by El Producto very slowly, so it'll smoke smooth and even. El Producto takes their own good time with my great tobacco, and you can taste the difference time makes.
Welcome to Backyard Cigars, a closer look. And what we have here, we have 3 cigars from El Producto. And El Producto 1950, and these 2 are from 1965. Now, I believe this one is a 1950 bouquet, is what they called it. And here we have the Corona. And this is the beautiful lady, the El Producto Queens. And we're going to get to those in a minute. First, let's start off with the oldest one here from 1950 GHP Company. And the specs on this are Connecticut Shade for the wrapper, Connecticut Broadleaf for the binder, filler, a mix of Puerto Rican and Cuban. Again, it was called a bouquet in the Perfecto Vitola, machine made, 4 7/8 by 42 ring gauge. This was, again, made in 1950. I purchased this, or I received this in 2023. It is exactly 74 years old in 2024. And it was purchased for about $50. And we are definitely going to take a closer look at this. So this is from the time when cellophane was still sort of a new thing. And the band went over the cellophane, of course, and then you took the cellophane off. And honestly, folks, in those days, they would just take the band and save it because you could redeem the bands for prizes and gifts, or you could give it to your son or your daughter who had a budding collection of bands. And if they had enough of these El Producto bands, they could probably redeem them for some sort of little gift. So what you wouldn't see is the cellophane coming off and then the individual putting it back on. You wouldn't see that. Now this one, the band is in the cellophane. So this is the 1965 Corona Vitola. And this was purchased for about $30 in 2022. And the wrapper is Connecticut Shade. The binder's unknown. The filler is Caribbean Basin, which is basically a mixture of tobaccos from Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Colombia, Panama, Honduras, Nicaragua. It's a variety of tobaccos, right? Again, the Vitola is a Corona 6x44 ring gauge. This is machine made. It is, at the current time, in 2024, 59 years old. And now we're going to get to the most famous El Producto product and cigar. And this is none other than the El Producto Queens. And why is it famous? Of course, because George Burns loved this cigar. And it was his favorite till the day he died. So the specs on this 1965 El Producto Queens is, once again, a Connecticut shade wrapper, binder unknown, filler Caribbean Basin, just like the Corona Vitola. This Vitola here is, I'm gonna tell you that it looks like a Perfecto. But let's open it up, right? Okay, see that? It looks like a Perfecto Vitola, but now there is a little bit of a debate with the Queens in regards to whether this is machine made or not. Now you're looking at that, right? And you're wondering, is this machine made? Now, my research indicated that this was possibly machine made, but my research also indicated that the El Producto Queens was treated just slightly better than the rest of the lineup. And it is possible that this 1965 El Producto Queens was actually hand rolled. Now, I have no doubt that this particular 1965 El Producto Corona was machine made and was rolled or using machines. But I'm not so sure about this. The roll on it sort of looks like this was hand rolled. And it could very well be the case. Again, I wasn't able to find out anything from the archives of Consolidated Cigar or any of the websites that I looked on indicating when they transitioned the El Producto Queens to machine made. Well, I do have some information on it. I'll get to that later, but not enough to really be sure. Now, the size on this is a 5.5 by 42 ring gauge. This again was released in 1965, and at its current time is 59 years old, very much like the Corona. These cigars were made in Puerto Rico. I'm not sure if the 1951 was also made in Puerto Rico. I'm not sure. So there you have 3 excellent looking cigars in very good condition. This one was purchased for $50, the other 2 for $30. It's the price of a vintage cigar. And that's a really good deal. And this is if you're going to purchase them at the vintagecigarstore.com. Because if you purchase them from anywhere else, you're going to pay double, triple the price. So let's get to this one here and start with the history of El Producto. So I'm going to remove this band and I'm going to unfurl this cellophane in its I wouldn't say infancy, because the infancy time was the 30s and the 40s, but certainly in its early stages, and it was not the cellophane that we know today. Nonetheless, it did protect the cigar. It did do its job. So, and this is the type of cellophane that doesn't come apart because of age. It's the way that it was wrapped at that point in time. In the 1950s, in this case. See, it just kind of opens up and you can never get it back to the way it was once it's opened up. Now, for our sake, we're going to put the band back on, and I'll probably smoke it with the band on, although it's really loose, you know. But here it is. It all started with Sam Grabowski. Sam Grabowski was a Russian immigrant who was originally a grain broker, and he later turned to buying tobacco. Sam Grabowski arrived in America in the year 1890, where he struggled as a bunch maker in a local cigar factory. Sometime in the mid-1890s, Sam turned to brokering tobacco. Sam acquired a reputation of being shrewd, yet honest, a wheeler and dealer. Sam Grabowski had no intention of starting a cigar company. He preferred selling in bulk. But one day, in 1905, an afternoon to be precise, in a store that bought labels from defunct cigar companies, Grabowski discovered the El Producto label. Sam Grabowski paid $11 for the boxes, the rights to the label, additional labels, and bands. In 1905, Sam Grabowski and his brother Ben Grabowski and two other investors formed the GHP Cigar Company and released their flagship brand, El Producto. The company struggled, but employed family members as rollers. The joint venture, which pretty much cost $50, provided a few cigar tables and some equipment. There was little profit, but Sam's reputation allowed for deals where only his handshake was needed, and in return, he was extended credit. Years later, Sam would say, quote, "I was amazed that even with my having so little money, the dealers came to my support immediately." El Producto cigars were consistent in being mild to medium. The flavors of competitors were always fluctuating. The initial cigars GHP Cigar Company released were at 5 cents. The competition at the time was from 5-cent Bayek Brothers Phillies and 10-cent La Palina from Congress Cigar. In 1914, GHP Cigar Company has 36 factories in PA, New Jersey, and New York. Sam Grabowski was chief buyer of leaf for GHP Cigar Company. He believed in oversupply. There were stories of travels to Cuba, Puerto Rico, where on occasion he would bargain, raising his voice in negotiating. He was known as a tough negotiator. He would seal the deal by opening his shirt to reveal gold bars strapped to his chest and around his waist to buy the tobacco in question. But in 1918, Jack Grabowski passes away due to the flu epidemic. Sam Grabowski was said to have lost his fervor and continued on as master blender, but not with as much enthusiasm. In 1920, Sam Grabowski, once reluctant to use radio, now hires Doc Kinnett, a communications professor from Pennsylvania, to shape a broad-based marketing campaign. This produced radio jingles, billboards, newspaper ads, as well as educational films on how to sell cigars. From the beginning of World War I in 1914, El Producto was top seller in Chicago, New York, and Boston. The major rival was the Dutch Master cigar. During this time, a candy brand by the name of Lifesavers attached their ads to El Producto with the phrase, "Make the next smoke taste better." And in 1926, GHP Cigar Company reigned supreme and established dominance over Dutch Master cigars. Rather than continue the losing fight, Dutch Master's parent company, Consolidated Cigar, offered $11 million to buy GHP Cigar Company. Sam Grabowski accepted the offer. The terms of the agreement allowed GHP to function as an independent subsidiary with its own salesmen and production facilities. Grabowski was prohibited from starting another manufacturing company. Consolidated Cigar hired Sam Grabowski to supervise the purchase and blending of El Producto, Dutch Masters, and their other Cuban Puerto Rican cigar, La Palina. So he was in charge of these three brands. Grabowski also purchased tobacco for all Consolidated brands up to the 1930s. So initially it started as just work on these three brands. And then when they saw how much of a genius he was at selecting tobacco leaf, he eventually purchased all of their tobacco. Now, from the 1930s to the 1950s, things started to change. In the late 20s, infighting was set to begin as El Producto and GHP Cigar Company existed as a separate production entity under the Consolidated umbrella, with its own sales force. The fighting was taken to extremes over 3 decades. Dutch masters and El Producto salesmen used various tricks and strategies to snare retail shelf space. El Producto salesmen used pencils to poke holes in Dutch masters' cigars to make it look like beetles had gotten to them. The same was done to El Producto cigars. By the 1940s, Dutch masters had become more of a national brand. To solidify national appeal, Dutch masters signed Ernie Kovacs and others for TV ads during the 1950s and 60s. During this time, the cigars were interchangeable. They tasted the same and had similar sizes. Sam Grabowski died in 1953, and the cigar industry mourned him as they should. Now, when we get to the 1960s to the 1970s, eventually more of the budget was focused on Dutch masters, and the GHP company salesmen were treated as inferior. Consolidated added insult to injury when they purchased Muriel Cigars in 1956 and gave Muriel Cigars more advertising and asked GHP company salesmen to sell Muriels as well. Talk about a kick to the butt. In 1968, a few years after this cigar was released, Gulf and Western purchased Consolidated Cigar and merged Dutch Masters and El Producto workforces. In the 1970s, El Producto budget decreases and the brand slowly fades away. Now, when we get to the 80s, specifically 1982, Gulf and Western divested Consolidated Cigar to 5 of the cigar company's senior managers. Looking to cut costs, Consolidated executives decided to produce the majority of El Productos, except for the Queens and Excepcionales, with a reconstituted sheet wrapper, otherwise known as homogenized wrapper leaf. Now, this was 1982. So, machine made, yes, but they hadn't switched over to homogenized wrapper leaf. Actually, many others had already switched over in the early 70s, where under General Cigar. And so Consolidated, they waited a little. And in 1902, Jim Colucci, Consolidated's Western region sales manager, felt the use of the wrapper was the beginning of the end for the El Producto. El Producto sold more than 200 million cigars in 1982. It then sold 132 million in 1984, 117 million in 1985, and 83 million in 1990. And finally, by 1995, sales were at 50 million. Now, one might say that's not so bad, right? I mean, that's a pretty good deal, right? I mean, you're selling 50 million cigars. And that's 1995. You got the cigar boom. People are still buying your cheap cigars. Not a bad deal. Now, in 1997, Jim Colucci, the same one, the Western Region sales manager, he works with the George Burns estate to launch 4 natural wrapped shapes in time for the spring of 1998. Priced at 75 cents to $125 for a glass tubo cigar, they will call it the George Burns Collection. Colucci promises they will be faithful to the cigar's storied tradition and to the spirit of Sam Grabowski. Jim Colucci mentions how he told George Burns that the brand deserved better treatment and that they should do something special with it. He says he wants to keep his promise to George and to his little lady. Now, as much as Jim Colucci had good intentions, this was the only thing that they eventually released. This is a picture from an eBay ad. It's empty. It's an empty box. As you can see, George Burns, Monarch Premium Cigars, imported from the Dominican Republic. You can see that it says the El Producto. And, since 1896, what can I say? I mean, look, I'm going to call it like I see it. Jim Colucci did not keep his promise. It was one vitola, and it was one collection, the Monarch, which we're seeing right here. If you go online, you're not going to find, and if you do, I'll give you a lot of credit, because I looked and I couldn't find it. I could not find not one picture of this particular cigar, the Monarch George Burns from the vintage collection. I could not find it. The only thing I could find was, of course, the picture of the box, which there are many on eBay that are selling for even cheaper than this. But again, I don't know if it came in a tubo. I don't know what was in it, the specs, nothing. So if it was intended to actually pay homage to George Burns and honor his legacy, I'm going to say it failed. I'm just going to say that. And it failed in the worst way, because when you can't even find a picture, and this is 1998, you can't find one picture of this cigar. And not only that, but it was released once and never again. So perhaps the sales were horrible, perhaps. Or perhaps the cigar just wasn't that good to begin with. Well, I mean, at least they tried, right? At least they tried. Here's another close-up picture from the eBay photo. And you can see here it says long filler premium cigars imported from the Dominican Republic. They're trying to stress this isn't our typical El Producto short filler with a reconstituted wrapper. This is handmade using presumably Dominican tobacco, but not necessarily. And again, just dumbfounded by the fact that I couldn't find a picture of this cigar. Unfortunately, this was the last of the renditions that El Producto offered, the Puritanos Finos. And as you can see here, this item is no longer made. As of 2024, I can find no evidence of any El Producto cigars being made. Whether they're machine made or natural, there are none available as far as I could tell. And if there's a website out there that sells them, and I did see them for sale a few years ago, as I would say 2021, 2022, they might have been available, but I don't see them anymore. So one can easily say that El Producto has, definitely met its end. Well, in 2011, Jim Colucci retires from Altadis, and that was probably his last opportunity, or his final year of trying to keep his promise to George Burns, who passed away in 1996, in regards to his little lady, the El Producto Queens. What we're taking a look at here, this is a 2024 online site that they posted this in 2024. And this is, I hate misinformation of any kind. I really do. I detest it. Misinformation to me is not something that I consider to be trendy and cute and safe. It's dangerous. And in this case, it's not so dangerous, right? It's just misleading, and it's for a newbie, a cigar smoker, just misleading and not truthful here. So this website, I won't even name them, but they listed here George Burns' favorite cigars unveiled. Now, what's wrong with this list? Arturo Fuente, El Producto, Hoyo de Monterrey. Come on now, guys. We know that he only smoked one cigar his whole life. Well, not his whole life, because he smoked a different cigar when he was in his teens. But as he became an adult and into his old age, to the day he died, he smoked El Producto. He didn't touch any Cuban cigars, Hoyo de Monterrey. He didn't touch any Dominican cigars, Arturo Fuente. And we're just going to scroll up a little bit here. Someone wrote this for this website, okay? I'm just telling you this right now. And they wanted people to believe, or whoever's reading this, looking up information on George Burns and his cigars, that George actually smoked Hoyo de Monterrey, and he didn't. And they're writing that there when it's a public fact, it's public knowledge that George only liked one cigar. Look at this. Appeal to Burns' refined palate. And I don't think that George Burns would have ever said he had a refined palate. No, he never said that. And were reserved for special occasions and moments of celebration. And then it names off 3 different other cigar brands that he may have supposedly smoked on special occasions. Look, this isn't harming anybody. This isn't, causing any damage, other than it's just a big fat lie. And I'm not cool with that. I like facts. Now I know we looked at the ads in the slideshow, but I'm bringing this one back because this is El Producto in 1950, advertising on the Baltimore Afro-American. And they did so as early as 1944. And this is something that I'm going to talk about more as I smoke the cigar, because it is groundbreaking that they were reaching out to the African American smoker, to the Black American. They were reaching out in a way that no brands were doing so at the time, and very few for that matter, if they even tried. Now, this is George Burns' Little Lady, as he called her, right? Then this is from a 1955 box of El Producto Queens. And so this is the little lady he loved. And now I'm going to show you the little lady that she became. There we go. So why do I emphasize the look? Well, that was one of the downfalls of the brand, was that they wanted to update the little lady, and they wanted to make her a blonde. And, a lot of people felt within the company, behind the scenes, that, it kind of gave off, and we got to remember the times now, guys. During this time, the misogynistic way of thinking in regards to blonde women, and, the stereotypes that were created from the 50s and on, a la Marilyn Monroe, in regards, and actually she wasn't a dumb bimbo at all, but that was one of the characters that she would portray in the movies. And it was kind of like a Hollywood thing that blondes were bimbos and not so bright. And this kind of followed the brand in the sense that they believed that the blonde bimbo was hurting the brand. When in reality, I mean, if you look at her now, and you compare her to a lot of the things we see now in advertising in regards to sexy women on just about everything, she's rather tame and demure. I mean, I don't see anything wrong with her, but that was the time. And in that time, that was the way of thinking. And they felt that she was part of the reason why El Producto Queens was not doing well. Now, you saw this before. This is from Ebony Magazine, 1971. Black Santa smoking El Producto cigars. And of course, this is a holiday ad. And I'm bringing this one back up because again, not only are they advertising in black publications and reaching out to that demographic, reaching out to the African American male, but they're also doing something which a lot of people were not too happy about, which was Black Santa, right? Because the whole thing was, Santa's supposed to be white. How dare you? Well, they dared. Now, this is from the 1921 The Retail Tobacconist, and it just shows at the success of El Producto. Occasionally, the sensational success of a single brand of cigars startles and somewhat mystifies the cigar industry. One of these successes is that of the El Producto brand, made by the GHP Cigar Company Incorporated. When this company started business in Philadelphia about 8 years ago, its annual production was about 150,000 cigars. The company now is making cigars at the rate of 110 million per year, and the number is continually increasing, a record which the GHP company believes it is absolutely unprecedented in the history of the cigar business. The company has only one brand to work upon, and it has felt that it must always hold the quality up to warrant its slogan, El Producto for real enjoyment, in order to succeed. I'm going to share something with you right now before we cut to the next segment, which will see me smoke the 1950 version, the GHP company. And why am I going to smoke this one first? Other than the fact that it's the oldest of the three, because this is the closest blend, or actually the actual blend that George Burns smoked. Now, he smoked this blend in this particular cigar, vitola and line, which is the Queens, right? And I'm going to smoke it because I really believe that's going to allow me to experience the closest thing to what George Burns would have enjoyed. Now, George also enjoyed this version as well because he continued smoking El Producto even as they changed their blend and decided to go with Caribbean Basin. He was just that faithful to the brand that he continued to smoke them. Just open this up one more time. Let me tell you, the smell on this is not pleasant. Not pleasant. First of all, you can see the redesign on this. There's no little lady. This actually cigar smells like it's been stored in someone's crotch area. I know you're all thinking, and you're going to smoke that, aren't you? Well, I may not. I've smoked this cigar before. I've smoked a 1965 version, just like this one. And I've also smoked a 1968 or 69 version. They all kind of had that smell. And I think it has a lot to do with just being in the tubo and the types of tobacco that we used, but not a pleasant smell. This one smells pretty okay. This one has a similar smell to this one. And again, just because you smell that doesn't mean the cigar is going to be horrible. It's just, these cigars are really old and that contributes to some of these smells. I almost forgot. So when George Burns was 14 and he started smoking, his favorite cigar, he said, was El Mosa Jose. And of course, I had to research that. And I could find nothing on El Mosa Jose. And then I found something that indicated that the name of the line was actually Jose El Mosa. And El Mosa means beautiful in Spanish. And it's in the feminine sense, right? Hermosa, una mujer hermosa, a beautiful woman. And again, I researched that and I couldn't find anything. And then I ran across this in the 1921 Retail Tobacconist. Jose Hermanos. It could be that he just screwed up the last name, Hermanos, to Hermosa. And so I'm thinking this is the cigar that George Burns started with. Jose Hermanos. Jose Hermanos, Hermanos meaning brothers. So that would be Jose Brothers. And why there's no and, who knows? Could his last name have actually been Hermanos? It could have. But nonetheless, the name of the cigar line here is Jose Hermanos. And I really believe that this is what George Burns started smoking at the age of 14 in the early 1900s. This would have been at that time when he was smoking that. So I think that it fits the timeline as well. Now let's go smoke this cigar. Welcome back. I am hoping that the closer look revealed something into the nature of what wrapper tobacco was like back in the 1950s. And there's a big debate, and I talked about it. It's not a big debate, but it's something of an unknown in regards to whether these were machine-made cigars or whether they were handmade. So this is 1950. The other two I showed you from 1965. I really do believe the 1965 ones could go either way. I found reports indicating that at that time, El Producto Queens was still being handmade, not just the fact that it was still using long filler and that it was not machine made. So, but then I heard some reports that in the 60s, they had gradually moved towards making the machine-made cigars. But then, of course, the famous Cigar Aficionado article, the El Producto Story, which is where I culled a lot of my information. Not all, but a lot. I'll give them credit for it. What you find is that in that story, it talks about going to the reconstituted wrapper sheet in 1982. So one thing is making the cigars by machine. That's one thing. A second thing is making the cigars by machine and actually using HTL, homogenized wrapper leaf. That's not what HTL stands for, but that's what it is. And what I'm saying is that there's a great possibility that they could have been machine made, but not used any of the homogenized leaf. So so this is definitely not homogenized leaf here in 1950. And it's definitely Cuban tobacco in the blend, Cuban Puerto Rican. The 1965 ones, definitely Caribbean Basin, of course, is the new blend. This is post-embargo for those. And not reconstituted at all, but not really sure if they're handmade or if they were machine made. And if they were machine made, it's not the worst thing at that point in time. Machine made cigars were considered pretty good. I mean, there was no stigma against them. That didn't come till later in the 90s, perhaps, when the cigar boom erupted and people were clamoring for their handmade, long filler, premium smokes. So here we're gonna take this and we're gonna cut this and we're gonna smoke a 1950 cigar from 1974. I was 74 years old from 1950, and I'm gonna tell you what I think. I mean, I've already told you what I expect, in the sense that it was quality, it was top of the line in its day. I believe this was a 10-cent cigar in 1950, or something of that, about that amount. So sort of equivalent to an $11, $12 cigar today. Welcome back. And I just want to say that sometimes I get asked, is there any special way of cutting a vintage cigar? And really, there isn't. I mean, should you be a little bit more careful? Sure, you should. Especially if you haven't done certain things that may have prepared the wrapper or if you haven't humidified it adequately. Here we're just going to go in for a simple pinch. There you go. There you go. That's it. Simple pinch. This is not a difficult cutting, because it's the condition of the cigar, right? If you have an overly dry cigar, whether it's old or new, 75 years old, 5 years old, then you may have issues with cracking. So that's really all there is to it. Now, in terms of fire, we're going to look at fire as well. Something to remember about the flame of choice. In these days of 1950, people used matches. We've talked about the history of Zippo and how Zippos were coming into the fold. They were coming back with a lot of the military servicemen that had them, but it wasn't something on the norm the way that I would be holding a Zippo, or the way that half of America would be at a concert and flicking it up, right? So matches were used. In this case, I'm going to be using my Zippo, which it's got the torch insert, and generally just want to keep that flame from getting too close. I mean, like with any cigar, a vintage cigar, you want to be a little extra careful. But generally it's the same idea. You want to get that flame going. You want to get that binder and that wrapper leaf burning in union. And that's it. That's pretty much it. I have smoked El Producto cigars, as I mentioned before. My experiences were with El Producto cigars from the 1960s. Always Caribbean Basin. Still what George Burns smoked, but not what he probably fell in love with, right? He fell in love with the marriage of Havana tobacco and Puerto Rican tobacco in the blend. He fell in love with American tobaccos that draped the cigar with the wrapper and the binder, all hailing from Connecticut. We talked about my theory on the first cigar that he smoked, the cigar that got him into smoking cigars, and he called it El Mozo Jose, or some people called it Jose El Mozo, and I gathered through my research that it was Jose El Manos, which was a popular cigar in the early 1900s up until the 20s. I didn't see much of it in the 30s, but it was a small Cuban cigar, nickel cigar to be exact. And that was what George Burns liked at the time. I mean, he was a kid. He was 14 years old. He wanted people to think that he was coming up in the world and he was doing well. And so he wanted to smoke a cigar because even then, cigars were still associated with success. And it wasn't uncommon, right, for 13, 14, 15-year-olds from Cuba to leave Cuba and either go to Spain or go to Miami in Florida and start up a business or try to learn the ropes, right? So it wasn't uncommon to see 13, 14-year-olds smoking. It was sort of a common sight, and it was also, somewhat of a rite of passage for young men, teenagers, really, because they were looked at as young men, but they were just teenagers. They were kids. But in those times, these kids were already out there looking to make an honest living, looking to be successful and to have prosperity and to provide for their immediate family at the time, mother, dad, siblings, and for their future family. Right now, it's a really smooth, mild, general tobacco flavor, nothing offensive, nothing out of the ordinary, really. George Burns was born Nathan Birnbaum in 1896 on the Lower East Side in New York City. He was the son of Jewish immigrants, and his father died of influenza in 1903. So he had to grow up a little quicker than most kids. He was discovered while working as a syrup maker in a candy shop, and he began working as a comedian and a singer at vaudeville shows, taking a stage name to hide his Jewish identity. George Burns started smoking at 14. His favorite cigar was a nickel cigar named Jose Hermosa, so they say. George was a 10-a-day cigar smoker for most of his life, and but later in his life, he said the doctor told him he had to only smoke 4 a day, and I believe that only happened after he turned 96. So probably around 96, 97, a few years before his death, did he actually lower his intake to about 4, though I really struggle to believe that. George's favorite cigar for most of his life was the El Producto Queens. His favorite vitola was a Perfecto vitola. He often stated that the cheaper cigars stayed lit for a longer period of time, and while he used cigars as a prop, that he did on stage, he really did enjoy his smokes.
Here's George Burns for El Producto Cigars.
These resort hotels are wonderful. Fresh air, exercise, spectacular scenery. Of course, I'm not on a vacation myself. I'm helping men get acquainted with El Producto cigars. Men who change to El Producto seldom change cigars again. I even have an assistant. Skilled help is hard to get these days. El Producto, please. Gentlemen, El Producto cigar.
Well, thanks. Say, aren't you,
Jack of Hearts. Light, please.
Hey, this tastes great.
Right. El Producto is the cigar with age in its flavor. Slow aging really makes it mild.
I like the shape, too.
Give a guy a cigar and right away he's a comedian. Give him an El Producto and he seldom changes cigars again. Try George's cigar, El Producto. Might even lend you my life.
Sweet, creamy, smooth, mild, flavorful, enjoyable is what I'm getting right now. Let me tell you a little bit more about the man that eventually was hired to promote and endorse the El Producto cigars. And he, although his favorite was the Queens, he would do commercials on all of them. I mean, he was just an El Producto man. And never mind the fact that they never pronounced the name of the brand correctly. They always said El Producto. But El Producto is basically the product, right? Or the, one could say is the gains of something, the gains of what you produced. But El Producto was the product. And it was a Spanish word. So George Burns was hired as the El Producto ambassador, and he would receive 300 cigars a month for free. He did print ads and TV ads, and he would talk about the love he had for the little ladies until the day he died. At 98, he said, and quote, "If I'd taken my doctor's advice and quit smoking when he advised me to, I wouldn't have lived to go to his funeral." So, and he was adamant about sticking with his favorite cigar line, even when it changed post-embargo. He still wanted his deal, 300 a month. He still got a little agitated if they didn't arrive on time. There was just something about the cigar that he felt that he needed to stay loyal to it. He never quite gave a reason. I mean, a lot of people say, oh, it's because they stayed lit. But it wasn't really just that. I mean, he didn't start with that cigar, and I'm pretty sure that the nickel Jose Hermanos cigars stayed lit as well. They were headquartered in New York City, as a matter of fact. So it wasn't like it was a straight Cuban product. Yeah, this is mild, but it's creamy and it's sweet, general tobacco notes, but very pleasing. So again, going back to George Burns, who loved these cigars, it wasn't that just because they stayed lit. He enjoyed the flavor of the cigar itself. And some might say, well, if that's true, then why didn't he quit on the brand when they moved towards Caribbean basin tobaccos? Why not then? Did he not change? Well, it's because we form bonds sometimes with our cigars. We form bonds with certain habits that we have in our life, and perhaps even emotional ties to some of these things. And I think that in his mind, and this is just me speculating here, he had grown so accustomed to taking the cigar out of the tubo, looking at the cigar in the tubo, and just seeing the band and everything else, and how it was such a part of his history, part of his life, that as long as it was not offensive, he was going to tolerate it and smoke it. The other theory is, and I think this is a pretty good theory, bear with me, is that George came from the time period where cigar smokers expected a mild cigar, a smooth, mild cigar. Okay? It was something ingrained in the cigar smoker's mind during those time periods that if the cigar was mild and smooth, you would have no throat irritation. You would not have to worry about smoking 5-6 cigars a day as he did, or more. And this sort of made it a lot easier for an individual man in that time to smoke 10, 11, 12 cigars a day, because they were milder, they were easier on the throat, they were probably lower in nicotine, probably, depending. But nonetheless, nicotine levels aside, they were smooth, easygoing cigars. And they were not large cigars either. So, okay, the Queen was a little bigger than this. And it was close to 6 inches. But you know what? Even then, and I've smoked that Queen, it's a really smooth, mild cigar that you can really just, you can retrohale the heck out of it. You can just enjoy it and not really feel it as much. And that's what I'm getting here. I'm getting this smooth approachability, this mild sensibility, and it's, like I said before, it's damn pleasing. Yeah, I mean, the aroma is not as captivating, but that sometimes happens, with certain cigars after they've been kept for a long time. This wasn't kept in a tubo. This isn't the Queen. This is the GHP and Company bouquet. And this is, Connecticut shade, Connecticut broadleaf, Cuban, Puerto Rican. This was one of the most excellent blends that you could find during that time period, during the 30s, 40s, 50s. I mean, if you got this, you were getting. Let me just take you back to something. A lot of people said George Burns liked his cheap cigars. Now, in comparison to what his comedian friends were smoking, they were smoking Cuban cigars on another class level, right? They were rated on another class level, I believe E, and they were class E, and they were probably 25-cent cigars, and he had a thing or two to say about 25-cent or above cigars, or maybe some of his friends that were doing extremely well were smoking dollar cigars. that's when you knew that they were really, rolling in the dough, right? But George went from a nickel cigar to a 10-cent cigar. So the El Producto cigars debuted with nickel cigars, but eventually they were makers of 10-cent cigars. They also introduced the Spana Cuba as a 5-cent cigar later on, I believe in either 1916 or 1920 something, or 24, they introduced that line, but I think 1916. But that's not the point. The point is that in his mind, he had taken a step up. He had taken a step up to a dime cigar, and he was fine with it. And it was good enough. He didn't need anything to be better about it. There was nothing in his mind that felt that he needed to smoke a Cuban cigar. Now, in regards to his criticism of Cuban cigars, in saying that they were rolled too tightly and that they would go off, now, that very well could be the case. There's been examples of that happening even in today's time, where certain Cuban cigars are just rolled too tightly. The draw is difficult. You've got to go in there with the draw master, or just give up the cigar and stop smoking it because it won't smoke. So that's a possibility, but it's not likely to me that that's the only reason. I mean, there's just more to it. I think he was just a sensible guy, didn't need a flashy cigar. Remember, they didn't really smoke with the bands on them. It was just a plain cigar. You didn't know what brand it was. You didn't know if it was Cuban or domestic, although back in those days, there was an eye for that a little bit in the way that it was rolled, perhaps in some of the shapes and sizes that were distinctly Cuban. But a lot of these vitola sizes were copied by American makers, so it wasn't like you could easily tell. But I'm sure that you had experts back then that could pick up a cigar and tell you if it was more than likely domestic made or Cuban. But nonetheless, George did not care about an all Cuban puro. He enjoyed Cuban tobacco, and he fell in love with this blend. And Caribbean Basin tobaccos, what can I say about Caribbean Basin tobaccos? The tobaccos that eventually he began to smoke once the embargo hit, they were okay. They were just not offensive. They were still mild. They were not any, they weren't as good as the Cuban, Puerto Rican blend. No way. But I think he consoled himself with just the ritual of having the same cigar, tubo, and so forth. Yeah, this is a really mild cigar, but understanding once again that most of the advertising that you witnessed in the ads were proclaiming it to be super mild. It was just the way it was back then. You didn't want a lot of pepper. You didn't want a lot of strength. You wanted a milder cigar. That was the American market at the time. And probably that's also one of the reasons why George Burns was probably able to smoke so many of these cigars and still stay healthy. And I'm not a doctor here, and I'm not trying to say if you smoke super mild cigars and you smoke 10, 12 a day, you won't have any issues like George did. George could just be the exception to the rule, as are many that may have been smoking for many, many years and haven't had many issues. He took good care of himself as well. He also made good money. So he had people around him that were also looking after him and making sure he was in good health. So those things were in his favor. It wasn't like he was just smoking 10, 12 a day and not going to the dentist and not looking after his cardiovascular health. He was doing all of those things. So bear that in mind. A lot of people say, oh, well, George smoked till he was 100 and he smoked 10, 20 a day. George may have done that. He may have still been the exception, one of the exceptions to the rule, but he also put in a lot of care into himself. He exercised. Remember, he started off as a dancer, So, he kept himself busy. He wasn't a couch potato, although as he got older, obviously it was harder for him to get out and about and do things and be as social as he was. But nonetheless, he had the backdrop of, fame, career, and a good home, money to take care of himself. So I'm just pointing that out because sometimes we're in situations where we don't have medical coverage, we don't have health coverage, we perhaps have health coverage and we don't use it appropriately, or we don't use it as often as we should. So keep that in mind. Yeah, I could just see myself. 1950s. This is a cigar that it doesn't give off a very it doesn't pronounce its aroma. It doesn't really do that. So I can't imagine this, making your house, if you're smoking indoors, making your home smell too much like your traditional modern day cigar that we smoke now. It would just be, I would say, more akin to, I don't want to compare it to a pipe smoke, but in the sense, because pipe, smells great, right? It has additives or it has flavors, and this doesn't. But I think that in terms of your tolerance level for it, it might be there with the pipe, in that it's really not, I even took it to an area earlier where I was kind of a little more enclosed, and I got the aroma a little bit more, but it was still very mild, like the cigar's flavor. Yeah, I am enjoying this. I really am. And this is the blend that would have been close. This is the blend that George Burns actually fell in love with this cigar brand. This is what you would say also was the popular blend of the time in the American market. It was one of, right? But it was probably the most famous. The Cuban and the Puerto Rican blend. It was just that way at the time. Domestic tobacco, Puerto Rican tobacco was domestic to a certain point, and it was considered the type of tobacco that you would want in your cigar. And Puerto Rico did not have, and still doesn't really, tobacco wrapper for cigars. They had some binders, but they were mostly using the Puerto Rican tobacco for filler, and they were marrying it as it was the custom. It's the marriage, and we've talked about that before in previous videos that I did. I did a review on a historic video called La Restina, and La Restina was one of these very popular cigars that employed the Cuban and the Puerto Rican, but put a huge emphasis on their Puerto Rican tobacco by putting the special seal, or it's sort of like an authentication in the band to let you know that it was using pure Puerto Rican tobacco, real Puerto Rican tobacco, and they wanted you to know that. So this is 1950, a couple years after the war. Times are tough for cigar companies. But you can still find a deal in El Producto. I've got to talk about Dave Dude again. Dave Dude has a channel, and he's been doing this thing that I learned from him, and it's basically keeping your vintage stick in a zip bag or in something, to humidify it at 72 RH for 30 days. And I did that with this cigar, and I did that with the previous two cigars, the Cinco cigars, And after you've kept them for 30 days at 72 RH, you then do the water rinse on the cigar, and you let it, rest a few minutes before smoking it. And I really do believe now that there is a difference in the way that the cigar tastes and burns in comparison to just leaving it at normal RH, 66, 67, even 65, let's say, on the lower end, and then smoking it with or without the rinse. I just think that the rinse is not for flavor so much. The rinse is really more for the wrapper, hydrating the wrapper. But the 72 RH is for the flavor and the fillers. Cigar has tasted really good. I mean, I just can't complain about it. Some people might say that with their palate having been adjusted to the Nicaraguans of our day, or even to some of the Cubans that some of us smoke on the regular, and then comparing it to this that is so super mild, that they couldn't enjoy it or that they couldn't get used to it. But again, I always say this, adjusting that palate, it can be rather simple or it can be a difficult thing. But if you look at it in a simple sense, you just have to tell yourself that it's a mild cigar, and there is nothing wrong with that. You can still, even in today's modern cigars, you can still enjoy a mild cigar, and it can be very, very pleasing. It doesn't have to offer the pepper and the strength that you get in modern day cigars to enjoy it. You can just enjoy it as it is and appreciate it for what it is. And that is a relic of its time, of course. Just think, you look at the timeline. Sam Grabowski purchased the brand in the early 1900s. I believe by 1914, already they were up and running with a couple of factories. Had many factories. I believe by 1914, 15, they had many factories, and they were a smash. They were just so successful. And in the timeline, if you look at it, George Burns was born 1896. So by the time he was 14, the timeline, I guess at that point, El Producto is kind of starting out. He's 14 years old. It's a dime cigar. He's not going to be able to afford that. Fast forward a couple years later, right, probably into 1921, 1922. And there you have a young man. George Burns is a young man at this point in time. And because, 1911, he's about 14 years old, right? So 1921, he's about 24 years old. And he's still not really making a lot of money, but by the time he's in his 30s, he's making good money, and he's buying these dime cigars, which, again, were kind of equivalent to what we would purchase in a $10, $12 cigar today. When you think of a dime or a nickel cigar, you think, wow, that's pretty cheap, but it wasn't that cheap. Maybe the nickel cigars were, but not the dime and up. So, I could see that in his progression, he would have seen that as a step up. And the timeline fits. Sam Grabowski was a legend, and I really feel that this cigar brand, now that it's discontinued, and the people that were behind it originally are retired, that it's easy to forget a brand like this and the prominence that it had and the popularity that it had in the United States. But this is a brand that really stayed popular longer than it should have, and that was in large part to the love that George Burns had for this cigar. Their advertising was shredded by the 1980s, and even in the 1990s, when they made a push to honor George Burns's legacy and the legacy that Sam Grabowski had left behind as well. Because make no mistake, as much as George Burns loved this cigar, Sam Grabowski was the genius behind choosing and selecting the tobaccos that would go into the blends for El Producto cigars, particularly the Queens. But you know what? It was his know-how in choosing these premium select tobaccos to craft a cheaper cigar, but a high quality cigar, a high quality cigar that could be respected and loved as it was by George Burns, but also by many others. And even when the embargo hit and they couldn't use Cuban tobacco, they were still relevant. They were still being purchased. For goodness sakes, in 1995, they sold 50 million cigars. Okay? 50 million cigars. Did I not make a point as to saying that Padron makes about, what, 4 or 5 million cigars a year? Maybe 8 million cigars a year? And they're accessible. You can find them. So that means that they don't all just sell out just like that. And that just goes to show the difference in how cigars were sold in such a large quantity during these times, like they're not now. This cigar really does stay lit for a long time. I put it down for a few minutes and it was smoking as if it had never been put down. Now, George Burns lived to the age of 100. 1996, a few months after his 100th birthday, he passed away.
What number of cigar is this for you today now?
This is my 10th or 11th cigar. I smoke between 15 and 20 cigars a day.
Yeah.
And it's very exciting.
Yeah.
At 93, if I can get it into a holdup.
Well, it's the little things in life, not yours. Hasn't your doctor said to you, not George? You got
My doctor is dead.
Ladies and gentlemen, it has been an honor and a pleasure to smoke something that George Burns once loved. And I can see why. The cigar was just really smooth, mild, flavorful, sweet, creamy, and it just offered a lot of pleasing notes. For its time, it was an incredible cigar from an incredible cigar company. And I really do believe that they need to do something special with this cigar line, revive it, introduce it in a special, different way to truly honor George Burns. But in keeping with the tradition, I just want to say to you all that thank you for watching Backyard Cigars, and say goodnight, Gracie.